The morning of the auction, there were 23 guinea hens nobody wanted, and they would not stop screaming. They rattled inside a wire pen at the back corner of the Caldwell County stockyard, gray and speckled and ugly in the way that made grown men wince, their bald little heads jerking, their voices a metallic shriek that carried clear across the lot and made the cattle stamp in their pens. The auctioneer had already tried to move them twice that day and given up both times. He set them last, after the goats and the culled ewes and the box of assorted laying hens, because he knew what everyone in that stockyard knew, which was that guineas were a nuisance, that they flew where they pleased and roosted in trees and refused to be herded, and that no serious farmer in the valley would waste good money on a flock of screaming birds that laid small speckled eggs and could not be sold for meat that anyone wanted to buy. So when the bidding opened at $5 for the lot, and nobody raised a hand, and the auctioneer dropped it to $3, and then to $1 for all 23, the men leaning on the rail laughed the low, easy laugh of people watching a foregone conclusion, and Della Renner, 22 years old and standing alone near the gate with her hands in the pockets of her grandfather's coat, lifted one finger and bought them. There was a silence, and then more laughter, and a big man named Harlan Boyce, who ran 300 head on the flats east of town, leaned over to the fellow beside him and said, loud enough to be a gift to the whole room, that the girl had just paid $1 for a headache she would be trying to give away by August. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this story moves you, take a second right now to like the video and drop a comment telling me what city or town you are watching from, because I read every single one, and I like knowing where in the world these stories land. Then stay with me, because what happened to Della Renner and her 23 worthless screaming birds is the kind of thing people in that valley still talk about, and I want to tell it to you the way it actually unfolded, slow and quiet, one season at a time. Now, let's begin. Della had come back to the valley in the wet part of March, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else the road wanted to take her. Her grandfather had died in February, an old man named Emmett Renner, who had spent 60 years on 90 acres of hillside that nobody in the family had wanted while he was alive, and nobody knew what to do with now that he was gone. Her mother lived 3 states away and did not want the place. Her uncle wanted it sold. Della, who had been drifting between a community college she had stopped attending and a series of jobs that never held her, was the only one willing to go up there and sit in the cold house and decide what came next. She arrived with 2 duffel bags and a car that made a sound like a coin in a dryer, and she let herself in through the kitchen door with a key her grandfather had kept under the same flat rock for as long as she had been alive. The house smelled of wood smoke and old coffee and something underneath that she could not name but recognized in her chest, which was the smell of him. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time without turning on a light. Then she set down her bags and began to learn the place. The land was steep and rocky, the kind of ground the county extension men had written off 2 generations back as suitable for nothing but pasture, and even the pasture was thin. Emmett had run a few cattle in his day and a few sheep, and toward the end just a scatter of chickens and a milk cow he had loved past all sense. The barn leaned. The fencing had gone soft in a dozen places. There was a garden plot grown up in briar and a spring that still ran clean out of the hillside into a stone trough her great-grandfather had set there by hand. Della walked all of it in the first week, in the mud, in her grandfather's coat that hung to her knees, and she said almost nothing to anyone because there was almost no one to say it to. The nearest neighbor was Harlan Boyce, whose good bottom land began where Emmett's poor hill land ended, and who had been trying to buy the Renner place off the family for a decade at a price that assumed the ground was worthless. She had met him once at the funeral, where he had shaken her hand and told her the offer still stood whenever the family was ready to be reasonable. She had thanked him and let go of his hand and not answered, which he had taken for shyness. It was not shyness. It was a thing she did, which was to hold still and look at something for a long time before she decided what it was. There was one other person on the mountain, and that was her great-aunt Ruth, Emmett's older sister, who was 87 years old and lived alone in a small white house at the head of the same road, having outlived 2 husbands and a son, and every doctor who had ever told her what she could not do. Ruth wore men's work pants and rubber boots without any self-consciousness at all, because she had earned the right, and she said perhaps a dozen words a day, and she had buried her brother without weeping in front of anyone. In those first weeks, Della fell into the habit of walking up to Ruth's house in the evenings, and the 2 of them would sit on the porch and not talk, or barely talk, watching the light go off the far ridge, and it was the most comfortable Della had felt in years. It was Ruth, in the end, who set the whole thing in motion, though she did it the way she did everything, which was without ceremony and almost without words. One evening in the second week of April, sitting on that porch, Ruth mentioned that Emmett had kept guineas once. Della asked what a guinea was, and Ruth told her it was a kind of fowl, ugly as a fence post and loud as sin, that folks used to keep before the sprays came in. Della asked what the sprays had to do with it, and Ruth was quiet for a while, and then she said that a guinea would clean the ticks off a place better than any poison ever made. That in the old days people kept them for exactly that, and that Emmett had run them through his pasture, and his sheep had never once come down with the fever that thinned other men's flocks. Then she said she was tired and went inside, and that was the end of it, or Ruth thought it was the end of it. Della sat on the porch after the old woman had gone in, watching the dark come up out of the hollows, turning the word over, ticks, fever. She did not know yet what any of it would mean, but something in her had gone still and attentive, the way it did, and she filed the words away. She found the ledgers 3 days later. They were in the back room of her grandfather's house, in a cedar chest under a stack of horse blankets, a dozen composition books filled front to back in Emmett's slow, careful hand, and beside them older books still, the brittle black ledgers of his father before him. Della sat on the floor of that cold room for the better part of a day, reading them by the light from the one window. They were not diaries. They were records, plain and unsentimental, of rain and frost, and what was planted and what was born, and what died and why. And running through them, year after year, decade after decade, was a thread she began to follow. The way you follow one color of yarn through a whole rug. Her great-grandfather had kept guineas. Her grandfather had kept guineas. And in every year that the books mentioned the birds, there was a second note, always brief, always factual, that no animal on the Renner place had died of the tick sickness the men in the valley called by 6 names, the wasting fever that came in the hot months and took cattle down and thinned the sheep, and that the county fought every year with dips and sprays and never quite beat. In the one stretch of years when the guineas were gone, sold off during a hard winter when Emmett could not feed them, there were 3 lines that Della read over more than once. Lost the roan heifer to the fever, lost 2 ewes, never again without the birds. And below that, later, in a shakier hand, 4 words that stopped her cold. Tell Della, guineas first. She did not know how long he had known she would come. She did not know when he had written those 4 words, whether it was recent or whether he had set them down years ago against a day he could only guess at. But she sat there on the floor with the book in her lap and the cold coming up through the boards, and she understood that her grandfather had left her something after all, something that was not the 90 acres and not the leaning barn, but a piece of knowledge that the whole valley had thrown away, and she understood that he had trusted her, of all the people in the family, to be the one who would pick it up. She closed the book. She sat a while longer. Then she stood, and she went to find out where a person bought guineas. It turned out a person did not, mostly, because nobody kept them anymore, and the few who did could not give them away, which was how Della came to be standing at the stockyard on that April morning watching 23 unwanted birds go for $1 while Harlan Boyce made his joke. She loaded the pen into the back of her grandfather's truck, an ancient green Ford that started on the third try and idled with a knock that sounded, she thought, like an engine composing its own obituary. And she drove them up the mountain with the birds shrieking the whole way so that she had to shout in her own head just to think. When she let them out into the old fowl yard behind the barn, they scattered in 23 directions, and half of them were up in the oak trees before she had the gate shut. And she stood there in the middle of the chaos and laughed out loud for the first time since the funeral. Then she got to work. Ruth came down the next morning, which she almost never did, and stood at the fence looking at the birds strung out along the branches like grapefruit. She watched them a long time. Then she said, "Those are the ones." Della asked what she meant. Ruth said that Emmett's old strain had scattered when he sold off, gone feral, or died out, but that these looked like the same rough, hardy sort, not the fancy-colored kind people bought for show, but the plain speckled ones bred by nobody for anything except surviving, and that those were the ones you wanted. Then she said the birds would need 3 things from Della, and only 3, and she held up her fingers as she said them. They needed to be let range. They needed water they could not tip over. And they needed to be left alone. "Do not fuss them," Ruth said. "Do not pen them tight. Do not treat them like chickens. They are not chickens. They are half wild, and you want them that way, because a wild thing eats what it finds, and what they find is ticks." Then she looked at Della for a moment longer and said one more thing, which was that a guinea would follow a person it trusted and scream at everything it didn't, and that if Della wanted them to stay, she should walk the pasture every morning at the same hour and let them fall in behind her, and they would learn the land was hers, and they would learn she was theirs, and after that they would not leave. Then she went home. Della did exactly as she was told, all of it, and she began to keep her own notebook, a new one, the first entry of which read, 23 birds, $1, let them range. The first thing that happened was that the whole valley heard about it, because there is no keeping a secret in a place like that, and the story of the renter girl who paid $1 for a pen of screaming guineas made the rounds of the feed store and the gas station and the diner in a single week, and it was told everywhere as a joke. The men at the feed store counter had a fine time with it. One of them asked Della when she came in for scratch grain whether she was planning to unionize the birds or just let them run wild, and another asked if she needed help hauling them to the dump when she came to her senses. Della paid for her grain and said that they were doing all right so far, thank you, and that she would let them know how it went, and she left. She did not argue. Arguing, she had already understood, was a way of borrowing the other person's certainty, and she did not want it. She had her grandfather's ledgers and her great-aunt's 3 fingers and 23 birds in the oak trees, and she had time, which was the one thing she had a great deal of, and she meant to spend it. She walked the pasture every morning at 7, in the mud, and then in the dew, and by the end of the first week, 11 of the birds fell in behind her, and by the end of the second week, 19 did, strung out in a long screaming line, working the grass on either side as they came, and Della, walking ahead of them across her grandfather's poor thin hillside with the fog burning off the ridge, felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know yet, and neither did anyone in the valley, what the summer had coming. Spring stayed wet and cool, and the ticks came on late but heavy, worse than anyone could remember, and by the middle of May the extension office was fielding calls from every direction. Della saw the difference on her own place before she understood the size of it. She had been finding ticks on herself the first weeks, on her ankles and behind her knees after a walk through the tall grass, the way anyone would. And then, in the second week of May, she realized she had not found one in days. And then she realized she was not finding them on the birds' patch of pasture at all, though the woods at the edge of it were thick with them. She wrote it in her notebook. May 14th, no ticks on the low field in a week. She began to watch more carefully. She would part the grass where the guineas had worked and find nothing, and walk 20 feet into the untended brush along the fence and pull 3 off her sock in a minute. The birds moved across the ground like a slow gray tide, morning and evening, heads down, and where they had been, the ground was clean. She started to understand, in a way the ledgers had only told her, what her grandfather had known. Meanwhile, the fever came. It came the way Ruth had said it would come, in the hot, still days at the end of May and the start of June, and it came hard. The first Della heard of it was at the gas station, where the clerk, a heavy-set man named Dwight, who knew everything about everyone before they knew it themselves, told her that Harlan Boyce had lost a calf and then 2 more, that the vet had been out to the flats twice, that it was the tick fever, and it was bad this year, worse than the old-timers could remember. Over the next 3 weeks it spread up and down the valley. The Hutchins place lost 4 head. A man named Pruitt over on the county line lost 11 and nearly went under. The sheep men got it worst of all because the fever took the lambs first and the ewes after. And by the end of June, there was a kind of quiet in the feed store that had not been there in the spring. The quiet of men who were counting losses and doing the arithmetic of a hard winter coming. Nobody was joking about guineas anymore, not because they had connected the 2 things, but because nobody was joking about much of anything. Della kept walking her pasture every morning. Her grandfather's cow, old and slow and the only large animal she had, stayed fat and clean and healthy in a field the fever never touched. She wrote it down. She did not tell anyone. It was not time. The first sign that something was turning came, as these things do, from an unexpected direction and by accident. In early July, a woman named Carol Meese, who ran a small flock of sheep on a few acres up the next hollow and who had lost 2 ewes already, was driving past the Renner place in the evening and slowed her truck at the sight of Della's cow standing in the low field, and beyond it the guineas coming in off the pasture in their long gray line. Carol had grown up in the valley, and she remembered guineas from her own childhood, from her grandmother's place, and something in her stirred, some thread of memory she had not touched in 50 years. She stopped the truck and got out and stood at the fence, and when Della came down she asked plainly whether the birds were what she thought they were. Della said they were guineas. Carol asked whether it was true what the old folks used to say about the ticks. Della looked at her for a long moment in the way she had, and then she said, "Come here," and she walked Carol out into the low field and had her part the grass, and there was nothing there, no tick, no sign of one. And then she walked her 20 feet to the fence line and parted the brush, and there they were. Carol straightened up slowly. She asked how much a guinea cost. Della said she did not know that they cost anything, that nobody wanted them, that she had paid $1 for the whole flock. Carol asked whether Della might sell her a few, or a setting of eggs, or tell her where a person could get some. And Della, who had not until that moment thought of the birds as anything but her own strange inheritance, felt the shape of something open up in front of her. And she said she would think about it, and she would let Carol know. She thought about it that night on Ruth's porch. She told the old woman what Carol had asked, and Ruth was quiet a long time, rocking. And then she said that Emmett used to sell settings of eggs to a few folks who knew, back before everyone forgot, and that a broody hen would hatch guinea eggs better than a guinea would, since a guinea was a careless mother, and that if Della wanted to build a flock to sell, she would need to think like her grandfather and let the birds do the work and take her time and not get greedy. "Do not sell them cheap," Ruth said, "and do not sell them fast. A thing that comes cheap and fast, people throw away. Make them wait. make them want it. Then she said, and this Della wrote down word for word when she got home, "Sell the cure, not the bird." Della did not fully understand that yet, but she wrote it in her notebook under the entry for that day, and she underlined it, and she went to sleep with it turning in her mind, and in the morning she got up and walked her pasture with the birds falling in behind her, and she began slowly, and without any announcement at all, to build the thing that would change everything. She sold Carol Meese a setting of eggs and a broody hen to sit them, and she showed her how to make a low pin where the young Keats could not slip through the wire, and she walked the whole thing through with her the way Ruth had walked it through with her, the 3 fingers, let them range, water they cannot tip, leave them alone. And when Carol offered to pay her, Della named a price that was not cheap, a price that made Carol blink, and then Della explained quietly, without pressing, that she was not selling eggs. She was selling the reason Della's cow was fat and clean, while the valley was burying its stock, and that a person could buy a dozen cheap chicken eggs anywhere, and this was not that. Carol paid the price. She hatched 16 Keats out of 18 eggs, and by August, when the fever had finally burned itself out and the valley was tallying its dead, Carol Meese's sheep were clean of ticks for the first time in her memory, and she told everyone she met about it. Not because Della had asked her to, but because she could not help it. The way a person cannot help talking about the one thing that worked when everything else had failed. That was the summer the story began to change its shape. It had been a joke in the spring, the Renner girl and her dollar full of screaming birds, and it stayed a joke through June, because a joke is a comfortable thing, and men in a hard season reach for comfortable things. But by the middle of August, it had stopped being a joke and become instead a question, a thing men turned over quietly. And the turning happened first at the feed store and the gas station, the 2 places where the valley did its thinking out loud. Dwight at the gas station was the first to say it plain. A man came in complaining that the fever had cost him 6 head, and Dwight, wiping the counter, said that he had heard the Renner place had not lost a thing, not a bird, and not that old cow, and that maybe there was something to the guineas after all, seeing as how the old people had kept them for exactly that before everyone got so smart. The man laughed, but it was a thinner laugh than the spring laughs had been, and he did not have a good answer, and he left thinking about it. That was how it moved, not fast, not all at once. It moved the way water moves through thin soil, finding the cracks, and by September there were 4 more people who had bought settings of eggs from Della Renner, and by October there were 9. She did not advertise. She had no sign at the road and no listing anywhere, and she never once said a word about the birds to anyone who did not ask her first. She simply walked her pasture every morning and let the flock fall in behind her, and she sold eggs and Keats, and by the following spring started birds to the people who came up the mountain and knocked on her door. And she named each one a price that did not bend, and she wrote every sale in her notebook with the date and the number and the name of the buyer, and the notebook filled and she started another. The birds bred and the flock grew, and Della let it grow the way Ruth had told her to let it grow. No faster than the demand pulled it, so that she was never overrun with birds she could not place and never had a single one she needed to give away. She learned the incubation trick that Ruth had taught her and improved on it, running a small incubator she bought second-hand off a man in the next county. And she learned to sex the young Keats and to cull for the traits that mattered, the hardiness and the ranging instinct and the plainness, keeping the rough speckled ones her grandfather had kept and letting the fancy colors go, so that what she was building, without ever quite saying so, was a strain. A line of birds bred for one thing, which was to survive the mountain and clean the ground. She read her grandfather's ledgers all that winter, cover to cover, more than once, and she began to see that half of what she was doing had been done before, on this same ground, by his hands. And she took a kind of company from that, alone in the cold house with the lamp on and the old careful handwriting under her fingers. The winter was long and quiet, and she lived close to the bone, but she made it through on egg money and keat money, and the little her uncle grudgingly sent for the taxes. And in March, a year to the week from when she had come back, she stood in the yard and counted her flock, and it was 91 birds. And she wrote that number in the notebook and did not make a ceremony of it. Spring came, the ticks came, the fever came again, though not as hard as the year before. And this time there were 9 places in the valley besides Della's that came through it clean, and every one of them had guineas, and every one of them had gotten those guineas from the Renner girl, and this time nobody could pretend it was chance. That was the year the thing tipped over, the year the question became an answer, and it tipped, as such things do, when the doubters ran out of room to doubt. Harlan Boyce lost 2 more calves that spring, fewer than the year before, but enough. And Harlan was not a stupid man, only a conventional one. A man who believed what the extension office believed and what his father had believed, which was that guineas were a nuisance, and that the way to fight the fever was dips and sprays and vigilance. And he had believed it right up until the point that it stopped working while the Renner girl's dollar birds went on working year after year on the worst ground in the valley. Harlan did not come around all at once. He was too proud for that. But Dwight told Della, one day in June when she came in for gas, that Harlan Boyce had been asking questions, quiet ones, about the birds, and that a man who asks questions is a man whose mind is already half changed and only waiting on his pride to catch up. He came in July. He came in the evening, in his truck, up the rutted road he had spent 10 years trying to buy, and he parked at Della's gate and got out and stood there for a while with his hands on his hips, looking at the flock coming in off the pasture in the long light, the way Carol Meese had stood there 2 summers before, and Della came down from the house and did not say anything and let him look. When he spoke, he did not apologize, not in so many words, because he was Harlan Boyce, and a man like that does not make a large production out of being wrong. What he said was that he'd been thinking he might try some birds on the flats, that the fever had cost him more than he cared to say over 2 years, and that he understood she was the one to see about it. Della looked at him a long moment. Then she said that was one approach, and that she had birds. He asked what she wanted for 100 of them. She named a figure. He did not blink at it, which told her he had already decided, and he said he'd take them. And then he stood there a moment longer and looked out at the pasture and said, without turning his head, that he'd bought cattle at that stockyard for 30 years and never once seen a smart buy come out of the back corner where they put the culls, and that he supposed there was a first time for everything. It was as close to an apology as Harlan Boyce had in him, and Della understood it for what it was, and she said she'd have the birds ready for him by the weekend, and that was that. She sold him the 100. She walked him through it herself, the 3 fingers, let them range, water they cannot tip, leave them alone, and he listened the way a proud man listens to someone half his age when the facts have him by the collar, and he did what she said, and the fever never touched his flats again. After Harlan, there was no more pretending anywhere in the valley, and the word went out past the valley too, because Harlan Boyce ran with the big cattlemen 3 counties around, and he was not a man to keep a good thing to himself once he'd committed to it, and he told them all, and they came. They came up the mountain in their trucks, men who 2 years before would have laughed her out of the feed store, and they knocked on her door and asked about the birds, and Della sold to them the same way she sold to everyone at a price that did not bend, with the notebook and the 3 fingers and the plain talk, and she never once said, "I told you so," because she had never told them anything. She had only walked her pasture and let the truth of it come clear in its own time. Sell the cure, not the bird, Ruth had said. And Della had come to understand exactly what the old woman meant, because what she was selling was not really the guineas at all. It was the years of the ledgers and the strain bred for the mountain and the knowing of how to keep them, and none of that could be gotten cheaply anywhere else. and so people paid, and paid gladly, because a dead calf cost more than a living bird, and every one of them could do that arithmetic now. She built the flock up to feed the demand and no further. She never took on debt. She never bought a bigger incubator than she needed or fenced more ground than she could walk. When a man from the state agriculture department drove up one fall and asked whether she would be interested in scaling up, in supplying the whole region, in taking on partners and capital and going big, Della listened politely and then said that she didn't believe she would, that she liked the size of the thing the way it was, and that a thing you grow too fast is a thing you lose hold of. The man wrote something in his folder and drove away, and Ruth, who had been sitting on the porch through the whole conversation, said only, "Good," and nothing else. The mornings on the mountain went on the way they always had. Della walked her pasture at 7, in the mud and the dew and the frost by turns, and the flock fell in behind her, more of them now. A long, screaming gray river of them working the ground on either side, and she led them across the poor thin hillside that the county had written off 2 generations back, and behind her the ground came up clean. She kept the notebook. She kept the ledgers, adding to them now in her own hand beside her grandfather's and her great-grandfather's, so that the thread of it ran unbroken from her back through the 2 dead men to the beginning, rain and frost and what was born and what died and why, and the note that ran through all of it, no fever where the birds are. She was 24 now, then 25, and she had stopped being the Renner girl and become just Della, the one you went to about the birds, and the mockery of that first spring had worn away so completely that some of the younger people at the feed store did not even know it had ever happened, did not know that the whole thing had started with $1 and 23 culls nobody wanted, and Della did not tell them, because it did not matter anymore, because worth had proven itself the only way that lasted, which was through results and not through anyone's argument, least of all hers. Ruth was 90 now, and slower, and Della had taken to spending more of her evenings up at the White House at the head of the road, sitting on the porch in the failing light, and the 2 of them still did not talk much, because they had never needed to. But one evening late in the 4th year, an evening in October with the ridge gone gold and the first cold coming down out of the hollows, Ruth said something she had not said before. She said that she had told Emmett, near the end, that he ought to write it all down for the girl, meaning Della, because she had a feeling the girl would be the one to come back, and that Emmett had said he already had, that it was all in the books, and that he'd written her name in there so she'd know it was meant for her. Ruth rocked a while. Then she said that Emmett had always seen further than people gave him credit for, that he'd kept those birds for 60 years, while the whole valley laughed at him same as they'd laughed at Della, and that he'd died before he ever got to see anyone understand, and that it was a hard thing to be right your whole life and buried before it's proven. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, no weight on it, but Della heard the weight underneath, and she reached over in the dark and took the old woman's hand, and Ruth led her, which she almost never did, and the 2 of them sat there while the light went off the far ridge, and neither of them said anything more. Ruth died that winter, in her sleep, in the small white house at the age of 90, and Della found her in the morning when she walked up with the coffee the way she did. She buried her beside Emmett in the family plot on the hill above the house, and she did not weep in front of anyone, because she had learned from Ruth that grief was a private thing you carried without display, and she stood at the 2 graves in the cold with her hands in her grandfather's coat, the same coat, worn softer now, and she thought about the 3 fingers and the 4 words in the ledger and the strain of birds bred for the mountain, and she understood that she was the last one now who carried all of it, and that it had come down to her the way water comes down a hillside, finding the one channel that would take it, and that her job was simply not to let it stop. She went home. She walked her pasture the next morning at 7 in the frost, and the flock fell in behind her, screaming, ugly, alive. and the ground behind her came up clean, and it was the same as it had always been, and it was not the same at all. She expanded the next spring, the 5th year, but she did it the same way she did everything, which was patiently and without debt, and no faster than the thing pulled her, taking in the 90 acres of her grandfather's and leasing, for a small sum, the leaning barn end of a neighbor's place that had gone empty, and building her flock up to meet the orders that came now from 4 counties, and she hired a boy from down the road, a quiet, watchful kid of 16 named Levi, who reminded her a little of herself, and she taught him the 3 fingers and the notebook and the walking of the pasture, because a thing that lived only in one person's head died with that person, and she had learned that lesson twice now, and did not mean to learn it a 3rd time. She showed Levi the ledgers. She let him read the 4 words. She told him where the birds had come from, the dollar and the back corner and the laughter, and the boy listened and did not laugh, and she thought, watching him, that he would be all right, that he would carry it. She was not yet 30. She had built, out of nothing, out of the thing the whole valley had thrown away, a small, good, enduring business on the worst ground in the county, and she had done it without ever once raising her voice to defend it, and the men who had laughed at her now drove up her rutted road with their hats in their hands, and the extension office that had written off her grandfather's hillside 2 generations back now sent people to study what she did, and none of it had come from argument or capital or scale. All of it had come from patience and attention and the willingness to look at a rejected thing for a long time before deciding what it was. On a morning in the 6th year, in the spring, there was an auction at the Caldwell County stockyard, and Della drove down to it in her grandfather's green truck, which still ran, still knocked, still composed its own obituary at every red light, because she had never seen a reason to replace a thing that worked. She was not buying. She had come because a man had told her there was a pen of guineas being run through, a small lot, culls, birds someone had gotten and given up on, and she wanted to see them. She stood at the back of the lot in her grandfather's coat, with her hands in the pockets, and the auctioneer worked down through the goats and the ewes and the box of laying hens. And then at the very last, in the back corner, where they put the things nobody wanted, he brought out the guineas, and they screamed, gray and speckled and ugly, jerking their bald little heads, and the men leaning on the rail laughed the low, easy laugh of people watching a foregone conclusion, and the bidding opened at $5, and nobody raised a hand. Della watched them a long time, the way she watched everything, and she thought about a morning 6 years gone, and $1, and a man named Harlan Boyce, who was dead now himself, gone the year before, and who had shaken her hand at the end, and told her she'd been the smartest buy that stockyard ever ran through the back corner. She lifted one finger. There was a silence, and then a murmur, because they knew her now, all of them, and the auctioneer smiled and said sold to Della Renner, who knows what they're worth, and the men at the rail did not laugh this time. She loaded the pen into the back of the green truck and drove them up the mountain with the birds shrieking the whole way, and she let them out into the old fowl yard behind the leaning barn, and half of them were up in the oak trees before she had the gate shut, and she stood there in the middle of the chaos, 30 years old and alone on the mountain that was hers now, in every way that mattered, and she laughed out loud the way she had that first day, and then she went and got her notebook, and she wrote, in the same hand that ran now unbroken back through 2 dead men to the beginning, more birds, $1, let them range. Then she walked out into the low field where the first flock was coming in off the pasture in the long morning light, and she stood among them while the ground beneath her feet, the poor, thin, worthless ground that nobody in the family had ever wanted, came up clean and living all around her. And she understood that this was the whole of it, that this was everything her grandfather had meant when he wrote her name, and she was not sorry for a single dollar of it. If this story stayed with you, do something for me before you go. Share it with someone in your life who has been told that what they have, or what they are, or what they see isn't worth much, because sometimes a person needs to hear that the thing everyone laughs at is the very thing that saves them. Then leave me a comment and tell me about a time you saw worth in something that everybody else had written off, or a time somebody laughed at you and you turned out to be right, because I want to hear it. And tell me where you're watching from, the town, the country, the corner of the world, because I read every single comment that comes in on these stories, every one. And it means more than you know to picture all the places a story like Della's can travel. Take care of the things nobody else wants. Sometimes they're the ones that keep you alive.